Well, good morning. Just to launch our discussion today, I want to point out that with the obvious exception of Ukraine, Afghanistan probably has the most challenging prospects of any country in the world today. 8 months after the Taliban takeover, it remains very unclear if the Taliban can govern as well as they can fight. Recognized by only a few foreign governments, the new regime is persona non grata with the rest of the world, and its oppressive treatment of women has put an end to hopes, at least for the moment, that they would liberalize their social policies. With an already feeble economy and a sharp decline in foreign aid, the country faces what could be a humanitarian crisis unless the Taliban can get their house in order. With roughly 2 trillion spent over 2 decades and a commitment of over 100,000 US troops at the peak and thousands of casualties, the US effort to bolster the country's prospects has ended, as we all know, in costly frustration. So to bring us an in-depth assessment of Afghanistan's very clouded future, we're very fortunate today to have Robert Hormats as our featured speaker. Now, Bob is currently a managing director at Tiedemann Advisors, a consulting firm in New York, and earlier in his business career was vice chairman of Goldman Sachs International. Among Bob's many government roles, he served as Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment, and worked as a senior advisor to 5 presidents on the National Security Staff in the White House. He also served earlier as Senior Deputy Assistant Secretary and Assistant Secretary of State at the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs. As well, he was a senior staff member for International Economic Affairs on the NSC, where he acted as senior economic advisor to folks such as Henry Kissinger, Brent Scowcroft, and Zbig Brzezinski. Now, way back in the day, Bob actually helped to manage the Nixon administration's opening of diplomatic relations with communist China. So it's quite a CV, to put it mildly. So Bob, welcome to the session this morning. Thanks very much for joining us. And the podium is now yours.
Well, thank you very much, Tyler, and I appreciate all the work you did to organize this. We had numerous conversations, and all of them I felt were extremely interesting. I want to thank you personally for all the work you did. I'm reminded I was not aware of the China program that you were beginning to organize at the library, or the library was being organized. So maybe I'll just join in that, because I do speak some Chinese. As you said, before the Nixon trip, or after the Nixon trip, I tried to polish off my Chinese a bit, and I'd love to pick up some more. So it's a useful language to have. Not that I'll ever become fluent in it, but it's good to know some words, and the Chinese like that anyway. So I will go through a series of issues relating to Afghanistan. It's sort of out of the news these days, largely because not much has happened lately up until last week, when it has become, again, a very violent place. For a time, the Taliban was sort of running the country in its own weird way, but in a very brutal way, but not in an unexpected way. But now the internal violence that has been plaguing Afghanistan for literally centuries is beginning to reoccur. And in Afghanistan, they say that the spring season is the fighting season, in as much as it's a very high country, a very cold country, and a lot of fighting does not occur when there's snow and ice on the mountains. But when it starts warming up, then the sort of restraint that some groups maintain during the cold season, or the fact they don't want to go out and freeze, begins to thaw, and a lot more violence begins to occur. And we're seeing that now. It should not be unexpected because it happens in that country almost every year. So let me go back to my earlier experiences in Afghanistan and give you a few thoughts. And we hope to have a map, and maybe we will still have one, so you could see the character of the map. Here we are. This is really very useful to look at. Thank you very much for getting this map, because if you don't really have a map of Afghanistan, it's very hard to get a sense of why it is such a complicated place. And you can see what is most obvious, and that is the huge border with Pakistan and the sort of southern, southeastern parts of this map. It has always had very close relations with Pakistan. In many cases, the tribal groups are the same. The Pashtuns, if you look in the map, the southern eastern part of Afghanistan and the northeastern part of Pakistan, just below it, the major linguistic and tribal group are Pashtuns. And they are the sort of the nucleus of the Taliban. But the fact is that there are many other groups. And if you just go to the top, you can see all what they're called the stands: Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and the others. So what I will try to go through with you is some of the stands. And if you understand what the stands are, then you go to the right, you see Tajikistan. Tajikistan, and it's so complicated, I'm going to try to simplify it. Each of these groups is linguistically very different from the other. Different languages, they're all Islamic, but they in many ways practice a different kind of Islam, one from the other. And the most interesting one from a geopolitical point of view is at the upper right, you see a very weird thing. You can see that little bit of Afghanistan that juts over and has a 25-mile border with China on the very, very eastern part. This is a very peculiar remnant of the Great Game. Why was it put there? It was put there because Afghanistan was then the British and the Russians' answer, or that part of Pakistan was part of the British and Russian answer to the Great Game. At that time, Pakistan was not Pakistan. It was part of what was known as British India. And above that, where the stands are now, was they were either Russian territories or vassals of Russia. In any case, they spoke their own language and Russian. They were under the control to a large degree of Russia. So what they wanted to do with that little border area on the right that sticks out, it's called the Crow's Neck, is to put that there to divide the Russian held and influenced territories, which were the stands, and British India, which was at that time, before it became independent, Pakistan. But it also has a peculiar element in that it touches on the very far right, the Chinese border. The one of the very interesting points, I'll just touch on it now because it's a sort of a peculiar quirk of history, but it's more than that, because one of the things the Chinese have been worried about is that if the Taliban government got in power, it would support, given its sort of fundamentalist radical nature, it would support groups that want to infiltrate themselves over that Afghan border into far western China. And as you probably all know, one of the things that China is worried about is the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs are Muslims. And the concern is that in that Uyghur area, there will be a potential influx of radical groups that come through Afghanistan, supported by the Taliban, and infiltrate their way into China. And the Chinese made it very clear, and the Chinese foreign minister actually went to Afghanistan even before the Taliban had taken over and said, look, we're willing to have relatively normal relations with you, but you have to control your radical Islamic groups, and specifically those groups that support radical groups, Uyghur groups. In the Chinese view, the Uyghur groups are radical groups. Not everyone agrees with that, but the Chinese are concerned about it. In any case, we don't want anyone coming in from Afghanistan with weapons or with fundamentalist Islamic thoughts and riling up the Uyghurs against the Chinese. The other part of the problem is that it's not just that little border. That's only 25 miles, give or take. The other part of the problem is if you look further north, you see Tajikistan. Tajikistan has a 250-mile plus border with the Chinese in the same Uyghur area, and the worry is that the Tajiks will be vulnerable to radical groups coming up from northeastern Afghanistan through Tajikistan and go over that very long border into China. And as a result of this, it's not on the map because CNN and the map makers are not permitted in that area, but there are very substantial numbers of Chinese outposts all along the Tajik border and along the Kazakh border, designed essentially to prevent the inflow of these radical groups coming in to support Uyghur separatists in Western China. So that there is a lot of military activity in the form of Chinese bases in that area. The other thing is, and this is another angle, the largest single Russian base outside of Russia is in that little corner of Tajikistan. They have a huge base there, right on the Chinese, not right on, but within a few miles of the Chinese border. And it's their biggest base. The second biggest base is in Syria, but the biggest base they have actually now in Tajikistan in terms of numbers of people. Now, why is that? It goes back in history because there were years, as you probably know, when there were major disputes between the Russians and the Chinese, and that was one area where there was an ability, the Russians thought, to go across what was a very porous border. So they wanted to keep a big base there, just in case the Chinese decided they were going to try to move troops into one of the vassal states of the Soviet Union, which was Tajikistan. Tajikistan was actually part of the Soviet Union at the time, although it has a different culture and has its own language, although it did speak Russian too. So these were all at the time parts of the Soviet Union, and the Soviets built a big base there, and now it's not part of the Soviet Union, but the base remains there. So in that little area, you have a huge amount of military force that mainly is designed by China to prevent radicals from coming into to support the Uyghurs. And the Chinese also don't particularly want too much Russian influence in there. And the Russians have a base there that's really a legacy of the Soviet Union, but they also keep it there because they don't want, and the stands don't want, radical groups from Afghanistan moving up through Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, etc., into the south underbelly of Russia. All these stands connect with Afghanistan, but they also connect with the southern part of Russia. And they do not want Muslim radicals coming up through these stands, either to radicalize the stands themselves or to go up further and to radicalize the large Muslim communities that exist on the southern fringe of Russia, within Russia, but there are various groups such as the Chechens, but they're not only the Chechens. So this gives you one sense of why those countries are so concerned about what's happening in Afghanistan. We clearly are, but I'll get to that in a moment. But I thought it would be useful just to give a sense of what's going on. The other is Pakistan, which is to the south. You can see the Pakistan area there. And there are groups, one of them is ISIS-K, which, and there are other groups in Afghanistan that have strong ties with radical groups in Pakistan. And very recently, they've launched some militant attacks on various towns along the Pakistan border with Afghanistan. And then there's Iran. The Afghanis and the Taliban are not particularly keen on taking on Iran, so they're not. And Iran has the ability to deal with these people in its own very unpleasant way if it had to. So Iran is not a major factor there, but the interesting thing about it is linguistically, Farsi or variants of Farsi are spoken throughout Afghanistan all the way up to Tajikistan. The Tajik language and the Farsi language are very similar. Farsis or Iranians could understand Tajiks and vice versa. So there is a cultural influence that goes back a very long way. And as a result, even though there's not a military or set of military issues between Afghanistan and Iran, there are cultural and linguistic links that are actually quite substantial. Now, the other country that you don't see on the map, and I use the map just to give you a context, is India. India, if you go south of Pakistan, you get to India. The Indians have been very worried that a radical fringe in Afghanistan will be able to sort of run freely with no constraints by the Taliban government and build up its forces and attack various parts of India, including and especially Hindu areas. These would be Muslim radicals who would be attacking various towns and cities in northern India. It's happened to a degree, hasn't happened a lot. I think Afghanis have other issues on their minds, but the Indians are very careful that the Afghan radicals, particularly the Taliban or ISIS-K, could use Afghanistan as a conduit to go into northern India and engage in various terrorist acts against India. We've seen terrorist acts against India, mostly perpetrated by groups in Pakistan, but the Indians are worried that Afghanistan could be a harbor, a safe harbor for some of these groups as well. And as a result, as soon as the Taliban took over, the Indians, which had had a pretty good relationship with the last government, tried to develop a good relationship with the Taliban government. Now, this gives you a sense of the complexity of this area. So you can divide it up into 4 or 5 troubled areas: the stands, the Chinese border, which includes the Tajikistan border, the issue of Pakistan, and then the sort of more distant issue of potential attacks on India, and these groups moving up from Afghanistan into southern Russia, supporting various radical groups that like the Chechens and others. And so the fact that you have a government run by the Taliban now is of concern to all of those countries on the border for various reasons and to various degrees. Now that raises the question internally. As the Taliban was about to take over, and it was pretty obvious to everyone on the border or everyone in the region that the Taliban was going to defeat the government that was there, the Ashraf Ghani government. They all sent emissaries to the head of the Taliban saying, look, we're not going to do anything. We're not going to send, certainly the Russians are not going to send troops back in there to stop you. But we want your pledge that you will do 2 things in particular. One is that you will squelch these radical groups in Afghanistan, more radical than the Taliban, and I'll get to that in a minute, and of which there are several. We shouldn't think the Taliban is the worst of them. And the other is that you will not allow your country, as was the case, and we know from 9/11, as was the case in the past when they let Al-Qaeda and other groups have more or less free reign to organize and build their strategy and their forces. So they wanted the commitment that from Afghanistan that they would not allow these people to exist in Afghanistan. Essentially, they would either kill them or deport them, although where they would deport them, no one wants them. So that would have been a tougher sell. Probably kill them or put them in areas where they couldn't do very much, which is, if you look at the way southern part of Afghanistan, it's pretty, there are very few towns. You can have like camps where you put radical groups and you can watch them. The bigger problem was that they would just allow them to do whatever they wanted to do to organize, and then they could support radical groups, or they could themselves move into other territories. Now, which are these groups? The biggest and the most troublesome is ISIS. We heard a lot about ISIS in the past. It hasn't gone away. It still exists, although it was dealt some fairly tough, although not mortal blows by the US and other countries. But ISIS, or ISIS, which is called ISIS-K, which is called ISIS-Khorasan province. Khorasan is what this old, the whole area used to be called, centuries ago. But anyway, ISIS is an arch rival of the Taliban. The difference, there are lots of differences, but I'll just identify one. And that is the goal of the Taliban essentially in itself is to rule Afghanistan. And they have very little, except one branch of of the Taliban that operates as a radical group in Pakistan. That's one small branch of the Taliban. But the bigger problem for the Taliban is ISIS. ISIS is much more radical than the Taliban, and it has a very different, its view is the Taliban is too moderate in their context. But the other is ISIS's goal is to establish this caliphate. And the caliphate would be that they would control not simply Afghanistan or the stands. They would go back to the old caliphate that was run for years by the Ottomans, that controlled virtually, if not all, of the Islamic world. And that's really what they want to do. So the Taliban has a relatively radical but limited role. The ISIS and ISIS-K have a much broader role, and they see themselves now as, and they have for a while, although they've been beaten back, seen themselves as wanting to establish various groups or subgroups throughout the Arab world and have control or overwhelming influence in various parts of the Arab world. Now, they haven't really been able to do this very well. They tried in Iraq and Syria, but their degree of success in other parts of the Arab world has been very limited, and the United States has given a lot of military aid to the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia and other groups to sort of push back on and eliminate, to the extent possible, ISIS, which they've done pretty well. But so the idea is that there are these two groups, and ISIS is now competing with the Taliban. And if you've watched the news over the last several weeks, you've seen these new attacks by ISIS on various cities, particularly Shiite cities or Shiite-dominated towns in Afghanistan. The goal there, they're passionately Sunni, as is the Taliban, but the goal but the Sunnis have gotten on, I think, tolerably well with the Shiites. No such thing with the ISIS people. The ISIS people's goal is to do two things. One, they have violent ideological religious differences with the Shiites, which means they also, of course, since Iran is a Shiite country, it causes them once in a while to have little skirmishes with Iranian forces on the Iranian border, most of which the Iranians prevail in. But they're now blowing up mosques and blowing up schools, blowing up villages that are controlled by Shiites in Afghanistan. And part of it is to kill and weaken the Shiites, but part of it also is to demonstrate that the Afghan government, the Taliban government, is really incapable of governing, that they are tougher. ISIS is tougher than and more effective than the Taliban, and that they ultimately would like to demonstrate to the population of Afghanistan that the Taliban should be thrown out, and that if the country is to be ruled effectively, then it needs to be ruled by ISIS. And so all these little things, you're going to see more and more of these. This is just the beginning. 33 people so far have been killed, mostly school kids, girls primarily, but also one one mosque. They blew up one mosque right near Kabul, and that included primarily men. So they've it's sort of wanton violence, and we're gonna see more and more of this. And the trouble is that if it's a problem for Afghanistan because they're much more violent than the Taliban. Not that the Taliban is not violent, but they are much more radicalized. Two, they will use any power that they can build in Afghanistan to support radical groups in the stands and radical groups in Pakistan. And even the Chinese don't want them because they think they'll support radical groups in Western China among the Uyghurs. And the Indians, of course, are very worried that they'll also support radical Muslim groups in India. And as you know, Modi is a sort of a strong Hindu nationalist, and there are disaffected Muslim groups in northern India, various parts of India, particularly northern India. And they're worried that if the Taliban falters, then ISIS will get more control and will provide a base for these radical groups that could go over into India. And the Russians are worried that they'll support the Chechens, ISIS will support the Chechens and others. So you can see what's going on internally in this country, sort of ISIS versus Taliban, but you can also see that it has a very broad sweep internationally. Now, ironically, most of the focus of all of these groups for the moment has been on the region. There really hasn't been much conversation with the U.S. The U.S. does not have, except for some human rights issues, which are quite substantial, particularly the way the Taliban has supported efforts to prevent women from working, to take rights away from women that they had under the last government. And girls can't go to school, for instance. Women have to wear the full burqa and can't get jobs. So all the advances that were made by women under the Ashraf Ghani government have been, for the most part, eliminated. And little children, girls can't go to school anymore. And this happened all in one night. They had committed that they would not diminish the rights of women or girls. But then almost overnight, about 2 months ago, a month and a half ago, they issued a dictum: no girls can go to school, and the women can't drive, and the women can only work if their husbands give them permission to work. And a lot of husbands, some more. The fact is, though, that under the old government, some of the men were actually not so unhappy with their wives working because they brought in more income, and they were going to school, so they were learning, and they could get better jobs. So there's not as much support for the Taliban among Afghani men on that issue as before, because they have seen the advantage for the economy and for their own families of women going to school and women working. So that has changed a little bit. And of course, teenage girls like going to school. They loved it. And so there are more and more demonstrations against the Taliban for doing this. And it does create another welcome resistance force. And a lot of outside groups have been giving money to Afghani women to support their demonstrations and to enable them to establish schools of their own. Very difficult to do. And there are very severe penalties for violating Sharia law. So as a result of this, you have more at least they've seen for a decade or so the advantages of women going to school, of women working, of girls going to school. So there actually are some stronger supporters of a more liberal regime now. But the worry is among the Taliban that if they go along with this, then they'll be even more vulnerable to ISIS, which will say, oh, you're really not supporting the Quran, you're not supporting Sharia law, and you have to toughen up. And then if they don't, then the worry is that the ISIS radical groups will do violent things against women. So there's a very unhappy and very dangerous situation for women compared to what it was even a year ago. Let me now step back and give you a little sense of my own experience in the country. If we can go back to the map, is it possible to go back to the map? Okay, thanks. I happened to be in Islamabad, which is in Pakistan, and went and when I was in the government and was going to Kabul. The only way you can go there is to go through the Cobra Pass, which is an experience that I commend to you, but not now. And the interesting thing, there are other ways, but the Cobra Pass is the easiest way. Easy, all being relative at this point. But so I went there, went through from Islamabad, then you go to Peshawar, then you go to the Cobra Pass, then you go to a place called Jalalabad, and then you go to Kabul. The Cobra Pass is, at that point, the border was technically closed. So the only way you could get across there was you went, you had the car, no car could go across. So you got a car, the car dropped you off and on the Pakistani side of the Cobra Pass. And then I had the American embassy send a car up to the Afghan side, but you had a long line of about 1,000 people. So all trying to get across. And the only way you could really do it essentially is to give the guard or the guards a little bit of money. So for $10, you were able to get across. Everyone had to pay it. So it wasn't as if I was the only one. But you had to wait. So it wasn't in the middle of the heat. So once you got across, the Cobra Pass is spectacular because you go through these huge mountains. There are no guardrails. The roads are very narrow. So you have the trucks and the cars have to be very careful when they pass one another. Fortunately, it's so dusty, the cars can see a truck or another car coming from the other direction, and they go to areas on the side of the road and wait, and then the car passes and they go on. But you never would do it at night. But it's quite fascinating because you see these huge mountains, and on the top of the mountain, there's a little walled village. And I thought, well, it's probably the only time in my life I'll be able to go there at this point. Now you really can't. So I wanted to see what these villages were like. The driver was very unhappy about having to do this. So I went there. They were very welcoming. We went to the top. You can see, for 100 miles, and they'd serve you tea, the hospitality is a very key part of life in Afghanistan, along with war, ironically. So I spent some time there, and then I went along through Jalalabad and then to Kabul, and then went up, because I was with the government then, I went up to the stands, or where the northern tribes are. The northern tribes are right at the border of where the stands meet Afghanistan, and went to see the head of what was called then the Northern Alliance, which was fighting the Taliban, also headed by a guy named Ahmed Shah Mohammed, who was one of the really remarkable people of that era. And so they said, you show up at 4 o'clock in the morning at this particular place. Don't wear any Western looking clothes. So they gave me a smock. And so I went there and got in a car, and then we drove an hour. I figured, oh, we're there. Then you wear a mask and very dark things over your eyes. And then you go to another car and another car, and the third car finally ends up where his camp is. And I spent a fair amount of time. He was explaining to me the logistics of the place and the how they were attempting to wipe out the Taliban, which they found very difficult to do. And then I spent about 3 hours there, and there are guns. Everyone has a gun, and not just, we're not talking about a Glock or some small gun. They were, large, big bandoleros, and he had one, and everyone around him had one. It turned out that about a month later, he was assassinated in that very camp. And it seemed to me hard to believe that, given as protected as he was, someone could get to him, but they did, unfortunately. He was our biggest ally, actually. So then I came back. I went to Kabul, and I met with then they had a president named Daoud, and he had a big gun on his desk. And I kept wanting to hear the president, very civilized guy, went to school in Britain. And it turned out like 2 or 3 months later, a Russian-inspired group had broken into his office, and he shot it out with the Russians, and he was killed too. So I got a sense from the kind of people I met of the environment in which they live. And I went to various other parts of Afghanistan, and you can see the differences. I mean, it looks like a country, but essentially, if you control Kabul, which is sort of the center, you can see Kabul, you control Kabul. You don't control the northern tribes. You're almost certainly not able to control the area along the Pakistani border, which is a big hotbed for the Taliban, and the areas near the Iran border. They're very sparsely populated anyway, so it's not as big a thing. But the eastern border along along the Pakistan frontier, and the northern border are where the stands are the really major areas. And then further south, the Taliban has a lot of bases as you get to the sort of southern part of Afghanistan. So the question now is where it's all going. This is by way of background, but it illustrates the complexity of this country, and the geography of the country, and the culture of the country, and the fact that it is virtually impossible to run. I got to know the Russian ambassador when he was ambassador to the UN, Lavrov. He's now the foreign minister. We used to have lunch every maybe 2 or 3 months. He said, this is while the US forces were there. He says, you'll never win in Afghanistan. He says, it's not, I'm not saying that because we're better than you. We lost too. You don't know anything about the culture. You don't have any history, and you don't really understand the complexity of these various groups and how they interact with one another. And it's true. There were some very good commanders. We had some awfully good military people here, but not understanding the culture is really, as you can imagine, a huge disadvantage in this country. And even if you control one part of it, doesn't mean you control the others. And I think the Taliban is going to find it very difficult to control this country. I think ISIS is already showing its muscle, and is going to do that more and more. And the question then is, are they going to allow these radical groups like ISIS and others to infiltrate other countries? And what does it mean for the US? I think the fact that the U.S. Was in there for so long and then left in a rather awkward way, probably it was advantageous to the Taliban and advantageous to ISIS. But I think we still have to be aware that there are these very radical groups, and there are some of them that are intent on infiltrating other countries, primarily at this point Western Europe, where they have fairly easy access. They go through Iran, or they go north through the Caucasus, and they can go to Europe. Getting to the United States is a little bit more of a difficulty, but we still need to be aware that they are there. And it's not so much the Taliban, it's all these other groups that the Taliban either can't control or doesn't want to control, or in fact is happy that they're there, and that they're devoting their attentions and their radicalism to areas outside Afghanistan to maybe just allow the Taliban to operate. So the story of Afghanistan, a couple of chapters have been written, but there's so many things going on there, and there's so many different groups and so many different brands of Islam, and I haven't gotten into some of them. It'll take too long, and then it won't matter much anyway. But just to suffice to say that it is still a hotbed of radicalism in the region, and then there may probably several groups that would like to, particularly ISIS, would like to establish a caliphate, and would like to go after a number of countries that are, pardon me, allied with or at least friendly with the United States. So that's where we stand at the moment. So I'd be more than happy to answer anyone's questions. Mal, did you want to start?
Bob, let me ask the first question if I can. The economy, obviously, it's got some real problems looking forward. As we know, as many countries in the world today, but they've got particularly bad inflation. The country is very prone to droughts. As you know, their crop production has been very compromised in recent years. There's been a brain drain from Afghanistan. The smarter people seem to be emigrating, which is obviously not good, and so forth and so on. And apparently their banking system is pretty much ossified in the sense that it's very hard to transfer money in or out to Afghanistan.
For sure.
So given all those negatives, do you have anything mildly encouraging to say about the Afghan economy going forward?
No, not really. And in fact, to add one more thing to that, and that is the government now has forbidden the growing of poppies. And poppies used to be their biggest single earner of foreign exchange, so that they can't even get, which is used for drugs, obviously. So they don't even have that. So I think the economy is just getting worse, which is why they need more help from international welfare organizations, which they're getting actually from the US and from Europe. But the other thing, if there is to be a small bright star at the end of the horizon, if you go to you don't need to go back to the map, but just remember in the northeastern part of the country, they're very, very mineral rich. The world's biggest copper mine, theoretically, but which the Chinese have bought. But they need to get a train to move the copper out through that little crow's neck into China, or somewhere, some other way into China, or somewhere else, but China would be the place that they would take it. And the Chinese are willing to do that. The trouble is, even under the last government, they were going to do this. The problem was then that there were, acts of terrorism against Chinese workers all along this theoretical railway route, and therefore you couldn't really build the railway, and you couldn't run the mine because of the dangers of terrorism there. So this is and there are other mineral resources, and it's a very mineral rich country. And the problem is that if you don't have stability and you don't have security, then it's going to be very hard for anyone to mine the copper in particular, but there are other things they've got also. So the economy is in terrible shape, which of course puts pressure on the Taliban, since they're supposed to be running the country, but they don't really know what to do because they've never really run a country before, needless to say. And they had power before, but they never really ran the country. Now they're in Kabul. They have a president. They have a government. All the government. They committed to the United States, the last administration, they would have diversification of the government with ethnic minorities. They never said women, but ethnic minorities. But they only have Taliban people running the government, and they don't really know how to create a business-friendly environment. So the difficulty is for them is that this economy is going to get worse and worse. It's going to depend more and more on foreign assistance. And who are the countries they're going to give for? India's given them some money, actually, because India doesn't want instability there. Russia went through a very bad experience, and I don't think the Russians are feeling awfully generous toward them at this point. China may be giving them a little bit of food and some medical support, but generally the economy is in horrible shape. Inflation, lack of foreign exchange. You're quite right. There's really no banking system. They use the Arab banking system, which is if you have a relative, you're an Afghani, you have a relative in, say, Chappaqua, and they want to transfer money, they go to there are various people, and you give them dollars, and then through this very informal Arab banking system, Muslim banking system really, then they get in 3 or 4 days money. I'm talking about very small amounts now. This is not military or anything. They would get money from a little vendor somewhere in some village in Afghanistan. It's a very unique system of transferring money, but it's not a banking system. It's just to enable your family to live for another month or two with support. But there's no banking system to speak of. There is a Bank of Afghanistan, but it's not exactly a trusted partner for Citibank or Chase or anyone else.
Now, speaking of banks, apparently there are roughly $7 billion in Afghani funds, which are held by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. If I read the press correctly, yeah. What are the prospects for getting some of that channeled into aid for Afghanistan itself? I understand that President Biden has kind of pushed for a splitting up of that $7 billion between some of the victims of 9/11. You may be aware that they are suing to take a 3 or 4 billion of that 7, et cetera. Right. It's complex. Do you have a sense of what's going on there?
I don't, because it is now in the courts. You've summarized it very well. I mean, the victims, the families of the victims of 9/11, and the victims and the survivors who have all sorts of diseases are suing to get that money. And then the question is, how much of it goes to Afghanistan and to whom? And even under the Ashraf Ghani government, which was a pro-Western government, They got some money from the United States. Some of that money they did get. But now under the Taliban government, since the Taliban has violated every commitment they made, not everyone, almost everyone, virtually every commitment they've made to the U.S. To allow women to go to schools, to allow little girls to go to schools, to allow women to work. They violated all those. And they've also not been able to control the ISIS-K or other radical groups. So the chances of this government, particularly in a very divided political environment that we have here in the United States, the chances of being able to transfer that money from the New York Fed, which is where it is, to anyone in Afghanistan in the near term are very limited. So I don't think they're going to get that. I do think we do give them welfare payments, and they're particularly in the wintertime, they have no source of food. So they've been getting food assistance and medical assistance from the World Health Organization and from various groups in the United States. And also, interestingly enough, from groups of veterans who served there, who have sort of deep feelings for the Afghani people and are providing money to various villages just to enable them to survive. General Petraeus actually he and I have been working together on this. We use some of the money some of the money is used for wounded veterans from Afghanistan and from the Iraq wars, but some of it, a small amount, does go to these Afghanis who worked with the United States as translators, who can't get out. As we know, they're trapped. So what we try to do is to get small amounts of money and to enable them at least to survive. But the large sums are not going to come. That's the answer.
Okay, looking at a question from our audience, Don Shields brings up the issue of channeling aid, as we've just been discussing, to the Afghan people. One of the hitches has been that we don't want the Taliban to get their hands on any of the money.
Correct.
That in fact, you hear me? Okay,
yes,
sorry.
yes.
Yeah, okay. There's been so much historical corruption on the part of former regimes that the fear that any new channeling of money is going to be partially siphoned off by the Taliban regime. How do you get around that? How do you keep the Taliban from sticking their fingers into the pot?
That's a big issue.
Yep.
And what they have done is the Taliban would desperately like to do that, and it would of course give the money to its own radical colleagues.
Sure.
But there are various groups, humanitarian assistance groups, Doctors Without Borders. There are groups in Afghanistan, and so when there's money to be distributed, it goes to legitimate international aid groups. Doctors Without Borders being one, but there are several others, and also food assistance. There are groups that provide food assistance in various villages. So this is monitored as closely as possible. Some of the foreign governments have embassies still there. We don't, but some of them do, and one of their missions is to monitor the money that goes in to make sure that the human rights groups not only are the ones that get the money, but that they actually are distributing it in the form of food and medical assistance and clothing. Those are the three things they need. And the problem with the country is, as there's only one really, there are two big cities. Kabul's the biggest, and there are a couple of other cities in the north that are Jalalabad, which is in the east, I would say like 30,000 people, something like that. So, but most of them are very small little villages. So you have to go out and deliver these in trucks or vans, and they're subject to terrorism. So the distribution of money, the channeling of money, is a very precarious thing. But they're doing it in such a way that they have, as best they can, avoided it going into the hands of the Taliban, because that would waste the money and it would go to Taliban radicals rather than the poor people needing. So it is a big, big problem, no question about it.
Yeah.
Tyler, will you enable your camera?
Sure. Yep.
While you're doing that, I was going to ask Bob a question. I think I have a better understanding of the geography, and you did a very comprehensive job of it. I think I even have a better understanding that the country, best words I could use is that the country is an agglomeration of tribes and regions and power players and other kinds of things. My
Correct.
question really is, Afghanistan, is it a nation? And not only is it a nation, if you, in your judgment, in the near future, whatever you want to describe that as, is there any possibility that Afghanistan will become a cohesive, self-governing, self-sustaining nation? Or is this to ever be?
The answer to the last two questions is no and no. It is an agglomeration of tribes, which don't, for the most part, get along. Some of them don't even speak the other's language. Most of them speak Pashtun, but the northern tribes, many of them speak. Well, I said the Tajiks speak Farsi. The Turkmens speak Turkmenistan. They speak Turkmen. They're about 60% speak Pashtun, 40% don't. So it is, even under King President Daoud, they used to have a king, and then they had a president. But even then, it really was there was Kabul and maybe 20 miles around Kabul, but it was so divided and so hard to get from one place to another, and so many mountain ranges that it was never, it is, in our lifetimes, it is not going to be a single self-governing country. That's why it's so hard to prevent these radical groups from organizing, because it's big. It's not a little country, but there are portions of it in Western Afghanistan where the government doesn't even try to go because they get killed. So there are lots of areas where radical groups can feel protected or feel that they can operate with impunity. And that's what's happening now. That's what's happened before, and that's what's happening now.
That raises the question.
Bob, we have another question from one of our participants, Peter Russell, who asked basically, what should the U.S. approach to the Taliban be, assuming they don't cooperate or transition to a more liberal, cultural and social approach? And a side question to that would be, as our military people have claimed, we can actually watch terrorist groups within Afghanistan, quote unquote, over the horizon. In other words, we don't have to be there to be able to take, effective action if terrorist groups start to predominate. Do you agree with that assessment?
No,
No,
I don't, because if they spent a little more time there, they would know that you don't know if they're, these military groups as I say, it's a big geographic country, and it is very hard to know what groups are coalescing in what parts of the country. I would say that there are parts of the country where I would say you could do that. among the northern tribes, if you have good enough intelligence, you can figure out what's going on. That is certainly true. In the air, but in the far eastern part, look, we don't even know what our so-called allies, the Pakistanis, are doing. They've been our allies for a time, but then things go on there, and then we learn that they have launched in Kashmir or an attack on Mumbai. We don't know that stuff. We should not pride ourselves that we have such good intelligence. We didn't even know how quickly the Taliban would take over Kabul a year ago. If we were so good at looking over the horizon, we would have at least had a better idea of how to execute a smooth withdrawal. We had no idea. And the military itself said they were surprised at how quickly the Taliban was able to take over the country. And we had troops there. We had intelligence people there on the ground at the time, and we still couldn't predict that. So anyone who thinks you can go to these little mountain villages and know what's going on, in the part of Afghanistan, there's a part of Pakistan that's closest to Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden lived there for a decade, and we didn't know about it. So this notion that somehow we're going to get really good intelligence, the Russians, who are on the border, virtually on the border of the country, they couldn't even figure out what was going on. So for us, 5,000 miles away, to feel that we could see come over the horizon in Afghanistan, and it just stretches to credulity, in my judgment. If you go there, now I would say that we probably do have intelligence people there that are trying to identify which groups are around. But we pretty well know that ISIS is there. We just probably don't know what they're planning. And I think it's very hard to imagine. And we shouldn't lull ourselves into a complacency that we're going to know exactly what they're going to do at any given moment.
Right. Now, back to Peter's original question. I mean, does the U.S. have many reasonable options as to how to deal with the Taliban, assuming they remain entrenched and are not going to change their ways? What can we do about it? Not much, I guess.
Very little. I mean, ironically, the best thing we can do, and it is ironic, and it does sound strange, is keep up a relationship with the Russians. And now we can't do it with the Russians, but a year ago we probably could. But certainly with the Chinese, and to a degree the Pakistanis, although they're not the most trustworthy people on these issues, because they in part don't know themselves, and the Indians. And the Chinese do have intelligence on what's going on in Tajikistan and in the eastern part of Pakistan. So they will probably have a pretty good idea of what is happening, but their chief goal is to prevent these radicals from moving out of Afghanistan into China. And the Indians have a similar goal to prevent these radicals from going into India. But from an American point of view, there are almost certainly some groups of radicals who have very passionately anti-American views. The difference is that ISIS, at this point, their main focus is on the caliphate. Their main focus is not on us. But knowing what's going on there, we may think we do, and we will get intelligence from the northern tribes. They're very good. They do have very good intelligence. I will give them that. But to stake too much on this. I mean, we have satellites, but these satellites have to go over Afghanistan. They have to know what's going on in these little walled-in villages. That's a big challenge.
It sounds to me, Bob, as though you've outlined a different foreign policy, not only for Afghanistan and the region, that I think I've read about in the recent past, that is based on a very different perspective of a I don't know what the right word is, disassociated, disconnected country and region that may not fit our perspective of a nation, which we will do whatever it is we will do with. And I think that's a very valuable insight that we've gotten from you this morning, and that I much appreciate.
Thank you, thank you. What was your insight before that? I'm curious.
Well, if I look at it, I would say we're going to deal with Afghanistan. Well, you said there's no Afghanistan. There is a geographic Afghanistan, but there is no
geographic Afghanistan, and then there is a government in Kabul. The question is, does the government in Kabul have does it have the ability to control other parts of the country? B, does it want to control other parts of the country? And C, even if it wanted to, are there not groups that are going to sort of, it'll try to buy off, or they'll try to buy it off? It's not, even when there was a king, which was a while ago, and a president who was Daoud, they would admit, and I spent some time with Daoud before he was assassinated. Even he admitted that their ability to control the northern tribes and the southern Pashtuns along the Pakistani border was very, very limited. So it is a very difficult country to deal with. And you might be able to have influence in one part, but the notion of having influence or knowledge or intelligence on the whole country is, to me, go there once and then come back. And then I would love to see someone do that and then say the same thing, that they thought we could predict what was going to happen. If you couldn't predict when you had your troops and your intelligence there, that ISIS was going to try to blow up people at the airport, or that Taliban was going to be able to take over Kabul in a matter of days, what makes anyone think that now that we're not even there, and the closest big country there is China and Russia, what makes them think that we would have a better knowledge than we did then?
That sounds like a very interesting perspective, that is different than I've heard, I've read, and I bet many of our members have heard, and that our government has pursued for decades, if not more. And so for that, I thank you. I think this is really helpful. It's given me, and I hope the rest of our members, a perspective on, I won't call it of a misunderstanding, or a lack of understanding of a region of the world that we thought we knew. We thought we understood. In fact,
well, that's the problem. Your last point is interesting. When Lavrov was ambassador to the UN, he said we had, because of the Great Game, where we were rivals with the British, we thought we had a pretty good idea of what was going on. He said we lost a lot of people. Do you know how many of the people, what percentage was lost in the war? It was a small percentage. Most of them were lost because of disease. They had horrible, because they just didn't know that, they didn't know the culture. They didn't, this is a country that we didn't understand the culture of the country, and they're right next to us. what makes you think you're going to understand it? And you're going to create a Western democracy. Said they, and I mean, it to me is like Alice in Wonderland. And I thought the weirdest thing was when someone got on TV and said, our mission of our troops was to teach the Afghanis how to fight. And I thought back to myself, I said, you gotta be kidding. Anyone who would say this, these people know how to fight. They just didn't have it's a question, do they fight for their tribe? Do they fight for their village? Do they fight for this sect of their religion or that sect of their religion? They know how to fight. Believe me, there's not a kid over 5 years old who doesn't have some, rifle on him.
They just can't govern, that's all.
They just can't. Yeah, exactly. And they don't. And they had a president who the first thing he did was to get out of the country during the evacuation. Look at the president of Ukraine. He's there on the streets every day.
What a contrast. Yeah.
What a contrast. And their president's gone, the Afghani. So they know how to fight. It's just that what are they fighting for? Different groups were fighting one tribe, the Tajiks, they're fighting for the Tajik tribes, or the Uzbekis, or the this or the that, or the Taliban's fighting for the Taliban, and the ISIS are fighting for the ISIS. And then there are these Hunzas. I didn't talk about the Hunzas. Those are, if you look at the map, well, you don't need to bring the map up again, but in various parts, there are these people who have a more Oriental culture to them, and are descendants of either Chinese or Genghis Khan or somewhere back in history, and are Shiites, and then they fight for them. So, and there are other groups like that. They're different groups.
Well, Bob, before we let you go.
And they don't know how to govern, because this group is not governed.
Yeah. Bob, before we let you go, may I propose that you invite Sergei Lavrov to lunch again, and maybe we can solve the Ukraine issue.
I will tell you, I got to know him quite well. I met Putin numerous occasions when I was with the government. But I met Lavrov a lot, and he's very smart. He knows us very well. I mean, and his English is perfect. I remember I was in the government when the one guy said, I'll talk to Lavrov in French, in Russian, and I'll work with him. This is not on Ukraine. This is 20 years ago. I said, you may be in for a surprise. His English is as good as yours. So he's smart. It's not that they don't have, he's as smart as they get. He grew up in the Russian Far East, so he is not, he's very knowledgeable also about China and about all Far Eastern Russian issues, which we didn't get into. But he knows a lot about the Asian part of Russia too, in addition to Ukraine.
Well, Bob, before we lose the satellite, I really want to thank you for your contribution to us today. I think it was absolutely fascinating. I think you told it well. You covered a lot of stuff. And I think you've given us a perspective that is substantially different than I think many of our members have. And I only say that because I think it's substantially different than I think our government has had, and a lot of others have had. And so for that, I really thank you. I also want to thank Tyler for his bringing you to the table. I hadn't known you before and hadn't known of your work before, and I thank him for that. I got to thank Joan Kuhn and the folks at the library who support us, and all of the members of our team who are out there someplace in the universe that we don't see and would love to see and would love to be back in front of, so we can see you and hear you and all the rest. Joan, why don't you take us home?
Okay. Well, I
Thank you
agree
for
with you.
having me, I should say first, and I really appreciated it and happy to do it again. You have a really good group. The library is phenomenal. And now that I know you're going to have Chinese, I will, if you can email me the Chinese
I'll send it to you
link.
right. I'll send it to you right after.
I do speak some Chinese, but I'm sure there are 50 people on your group that are
No,
better than I am.
there's a dedicated about 10 people and from all walks of life here, and a lot of them were in the government. So I think you would enjoy it and fit right in. I'll send your email to them right away, and I'll send you the link for tomorrow at 7 o'clock. So it is my pleasure to do it because I've enjoyed this talk so much.
I would make one recommendation
Yes.
for people who want to understand this area, the Central Asian area. Read the history of Genghis Khan or the Mughal Empire, because virtually they controlled all of what we know today as Russia and virtually all of what we know today as Central Asia. And knowing the history of the Mughal Empire, so much of what we have today is one way or another derivative of the way they divided the world up and the way they ran that empire. We look at it as sort of a group of barbarians, and to a degree they were, but they constructed this whole region. Is there a Mongol there in your group?
There's a whole group here.
A whole group of Mongols. Good.
A whole group of talkative
Anyway,
people.
I would recommend that. I'd recommend getting a book on Genghis Khan, and just because it'll give you. I've gone to some of the history. This brings you further back.
Okay.
Thanks again.
Thank you for having me.
So thank you all. Thank the audience for coming,
Thanks,
and
Bob.
Bob and Mal and of Tyler always. Thank you all for being here. And I hope we'll see you in our programs. Don't forget to go to our website, which is chappaqua.library.org.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you for the invitation.
Excellent. Hope to see
Thank
you
you.
again.
Thank you for
Bye-bye.
inviting
Thanks,
me.
Bob. Yep.
Bye. Thank you.